I have good and bad news. Which one do you want to hear first? Probably the bad news. Well, this is our 3D model, but I will not be pouring the resin today. This temple is in fact meant to be part of a huge diorama whose base will be flooded with resin. If I pour the resin today, the color, height and even borders of the two models would not probably match, ruining the entire project, and we don't want that, don't we? The good news is that I'm going to do something crazy. Is it good news? Well, let's find out. I used polystyrene to make the blocks of the building. For the base, I used plywood. At this point, I remembered an important detail. When resin hardens, it gets very hot enough to melt polystyrene. So I decided to make the main hall out of wood. To pave the square in front of the temple, I used tiles of different shapes and colors. I used darker tiles for the roof and decorations in order to create some contrasts. Carving polystyrene is very easy, cleaning not as much. There was no need to make of wood the other parts of the temple, since they would not be in direct contact with the resin. For the decorations, I used broken tiles. After all, only one edge would be visible. Some bricks tried to leave the model, as if they knew what would happen later. Fools. I cut out one corner from the roof in order to make it look like partially collapsed. I used construction mortar to fill the gaps and cracks among the tiles. And for the rest of the building as well. I used pliers to create cracks and fractures in the building. For smaller cracks, I used smaller pliers, and and finally a knoll for the details. I placed a LED light at the center of the temple to create some atmosphere. I made the stalagmites with polystyrene, just like the rest of the model. For the terrain, I prepared a mixture of mortar and sand to make it look rougher. I then sprinkled some gravel in order to make the terrain even more irregular. I used different shades of brown for the base color, mixed with a lot of water. As you can see, the base color is just like watercolor. Acrylic colors have their own texture, specularity, and roughness, so I used very little color in order to preserve the characteristics of the material below, which is pretty much like rock. For the shadows, I used an extremely diluted mix of water and color and checked on blotting paper if it was diluted enough. When you apply the color, you will get the impression that the model turns black, but actually when the color dries, the result is way more subtle. For the highlights, I used the dry brush technique, which consists in having the brush basically dry when you apply the color. I finally joined all the pieces together using the same mix that I used for the terrain, but with less water. To make the debris, I crushed some bricks and sprinkled where the building was more damaged. To make the moss, I used the airbrush and a very thin brush for the finer details. To create patches of dirt, I used a very diluted mix of water and brown color. To make the stones, I took a handful of earth just outside my door and left it to dry for a couple of weeks. For the grass, I used an olive green powder and a very diluted mix of vinylic glue and water. To fill the gaps between the bricks, I just shake the model and let gravity do its job. I made the ribs of the rowboat out of a walnut wood board. For the rowboat planking, I used 0.5 mm wooden strips. To seal the gaps between the planks, I used vinylic glue, mixed with brown color. I painted the hull of the boat as well as all the other wooden parts with a polyurethane impregnating agent. I finally placed some angry pirates on the boat. At this point, I told myself, okay, there has been a huge cataclysm here, and cataclysm to damage. The model is not damaged enough. Let's do some real damage.
Don't stop it now! We're starting, we don't stop!
I added some parts to the model in order to compensate for the difference in heights. I then painted the fracture in the ground as well as the terrain with the same criteria I used before for the rest of the model. In the parts of the model that would end up underwater, I added corals, seaweed, and any kind of vegetation you can find in the seabed. Finally, I added some roots hanging from the upper part of the model.